I am the Charlatan Wonder, and I'd like to ask you a simple question. Is a man not entitled to the full enjoyment of his full-price video game? No, says the man in Irvine, California. There must be subscription fees and microtransactions for cosmetics. No, said the man in Montreal. We must partition the game to make more sequels in the future. No, said the man in Tokyo. We're going to take our intellectual properties and make them into gambling machines. I rejected all of those answers. Instead, I chose Colombia? Wait, no, stop, go back, no! It's not exactly hard to figure out that I'm an enormous fan of the BioShock franchise. Heck, look at my original handle before I started all this Charlatan Wonder business. And suffice to say, I was insanely excited for BioShock Infinite's coming out back in 2013, to the point of where I intentionally took the day off work and school, grabbed myself a case of energy drinks by my side, and fervently, violently kept on exiting and restarting Steam until I remember at exactly 9:32 p.m. the night before, BioShock Infinite unlocked on my computer. And I played the crap out of it the whole night, non-stop. And it was an amazing experience. But I can't help but remember the news story about how the very cover of BioShock Infinite was changed to appeal to a more dude bro audience, sporting, instead of a few other alternate covers that looked like they might have been the original intention, the stereotypical scruffy-looking white dude scowling holding a gun with varying levels of color contrast in the background. And then, a few years later, as I was playing this, I realized that wasn't the only compromise made to BioShock Infinite for it to exist. The first thing we'll talk about concerning what went wrong with BioShock Infinite is how a lot of mechanics got changed in the name of making it a more mainstream shooty type game instead of a BioShock game, and it really hinders it in some areas. The first of which we'll look at is the general speed and death mechanics involving combat. Whereas in BioShock you could easily creep around, where it wasn't exactly bragged about with the stealth system, but you could very much crawl around avoiding splicers. In BioShock Infinite, you're just barreling from area to area, going straight into combat without ever once thinking, okay, is it a good idea to fight these people right now? And it's sort of band-aid fixed by the fact that your sidekick is a demigod that can literally pull any item you could possibly need out of thin air. So you just keep on barreling into enemy group after enemy group, and they come in waves as you play linearly. Alternatively, if you somehow manage to die in BioShock Infinite, you get a strange little cinematic, you lose like $50, and you're just miraculously right back where you started. No backtracking, no serious setbacks of losing your edge or your element of surprise. It's just, okay, get back in there. It feels like a lot of it was just meant to speed things along and keep the player constantly moving forward because they didn't want them exploring too much. And we'll touch on that in a bit. But the next major part about that is the handyman being the replacement for the Big Daddy. When you fought a Big Daddy, it was a very informed decision. You often would wait maybe half an hour for the Big Daddy to come into just the right spot with just the right turrets and exploding barrels walking around, laying around, the daddies walking around. And then you would pull the trigger and start what you'd hope to be a very close but very fruitful fight. In BioShock Infinite, it's like, okay, here's a handyman, bro, have fun. And it just takes away the magic of fighting these sort of pseudo-bosses, where BioShock would intentionally tease you by having Big Daddy spawn right in front of a bunch of exploding barrels where you weren't really prepared, thinking to yourself, okay, can I do this? It's just so good. Do I have it right now? That's all gone when fighting handymen. And the reward is also significantly lessened. You might get a throwaway piece of equipment, whereas versus a Big Daddy, you not only were given the choice in how you wanted to advance the plot, but you get Precious Atom that was literally everything you needed in the game, from an ability to get more ammo, to your plasmids. Then you just continue on the path to your next objective, which brings us into the linearity of BioShock Infinite versus the previous 2 games. Almost all the levels in BioShock Infinite follow a formula of opening plaza area with one small offshoot, linear fight to the main objective area, and then you backtrack to the plaza area after doing the objective so you can advance to the next level. One of the best things about the original BioShock maps and levels was their openness and how you could go about the whole area exploring nooks and crannies that were on no given path, so you can find the best place to take down Big Daddies and the best way to prepare for the boss fights and objectives. That's just not present in Infinite. There's no trapping, there's no setting things up. You just run from one end of the level to the other, and then you sprint back to the main plaza area, and you're done. This also unintentionally hurts Infinite's gameplay and memorability by just that. The levels are mostly unmemorable. Aside from a couple areas I can think of off the top of my head, like Finkton or Battleship Bay, nothing really sticks out in BioShock Infinite. Everything's just kind of the same cobblestone linear shoot 'em up. The gunplay in Infinite also reeks of simplification for the sake of appealing to the mainstream. Whereas in the original BioShock, you can pick up one of each gun, in Infinite, you're frequently stuck between 2, and honestly, you can complete the game only really using maybe the hand cannon and the rocket launcher. So it really makes you not even bother to pick up and explore the other weapons in this game. And this also serves as a lovely segue into the next major idea of why BioShock Infinite went wrong, in that so many mechanics from the original BioShock were held over and brought to Infinite where they just don't make sense. Despite the fact that it's kind of implied that you're constantly tossing your guns aside for different ones to fit the situations, the gun's upgrade system still exists. In the original BioShocks, your upgrades came with cosmetic changes to your weapons to kind of show you what exactly they did to your gun to make it better. In BioShock Infinite, it's just a tick box at a vendor, which doesn't make sense if I'm going to toss aside my hand cannon for the next 15 minutes because I need a shotgun. How on earth is my hand cannon that I picked up 20 minutes later going to have the same stat boost? And it also takes away the individuality of the guns. While the models in Infinite are gorgeous, they all feel like just throwaways because that's just what you're going to do with them if you're trying to vary your playstyle and you see another enemy. In the original BioShock, there might have been many like it, but these particular weapons were yours. Through the upgrades you chose and the fact that you never had to throw away a gun, you grew attached to your weapons and you knew what they were good for. There was no cursing to yourself because you brought a crossbow and pistol to a Big Daddy fight, because you always had your rocket launcher on your person. We see nonsensical story elements in the audio diaries in Infinite too. While in the original BioShock they explained it into the story as Andrew Ryan wanting to record all the moments of Rapture's rise, so he hired Fontaine to create and distribute these things, and on the side made a quick buck by making motivational speeches or something with them. In BioShock Infinite, it's just like, oh hey, here's this cool thing at the World's Fair. So it makes no sense for folks like Daisy Fitzroy, who was originally a poor handmaiden to Lady Comstock, to have ready access to all the voxophones she could possibly need. And then from a gameplay perspective, while in the original BioShock it made sense to have the audio diaries, because nearly everyone you talked to or witnessed was so insane to the point of where they could not tell you a coherent story, in BioShock Infinite, people still have their wits about them for the most part. And it also doesn't help that you have a person with you at all times in BioShock Infinite, and Elizabeth never shuts up. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a way that you need to have either one or the other. Either do a thing like in the Mass Effect games where if you're walking with a certain companion, you can stop by a certain area and they'll tell you something about the area, or just have the audio diaries. I stopped bothering to listen or even pick up audio diaries in BioShock Infinite because I always knew I'd have to play them 10 or 20 times as I'm going along in order to get the whole story without being interrupted by Elizabeth. The audio diaries in the original BioShock were implemented as a way to seamlessly tell backstory while the player goes along through the remains of Rapture, And ironically, the voxophones do the opposite. They keep on pulling you out because you have to stop, wait somewhere so you know that nobody is going to interrupt you while you're playing this audio log, and then you can continue on your way. A final holdover that I can think of, but I don't want to get too much into because it's been beaten to death, is it just also makes no sense for Booker DeWitt to be scavenging through trash cans in the middle of a city that very obviously is just now experiencing its downturn. In the original BioShock, it had been about a decade since the city was fresh and new, and therefore it needed a bit of scavenging. Doubling down on BioShock 2, where it had now been at least a decade since the city had fallen, and therefore anything you could possibly find was a boon. Why are we scavenging in Infinite? Especially when there are stores we can just go loot right over there. Moreover, back to that, you are traveling with a companion that can literally pull anything out of thin air or holes in a dimension thing. Scavenging just doesn't make sense. Okay, let's wrap it all up now. The final major argument about this is thematically, and because of all the previously stated reasons, BioShock Infinite shouldn't be called BioShock Infinite. In fact, it'd be better off for both parties if it was called something else. One of the main things is, back to that thematic idea, BioShocks 1 and 2 explore themes like, if you let everyone act in their own self-interest and their own self-interest alone, they will eventually cut out their own safety net in an attempt to undercut their enemies, and everyone will suffer because of it. Whereas in BioShock 2, we talk about how if you let a commune become so communal that they forget themselves, eventually a cult of personality is going to take over and co-opt the group. In BioShock Infinite, it's, yeah, racism is bad, and also none of your choices ever matter. There's no real meat to it. You can't really dig into that. It's just they're saying a thing. They're not presenting an idea. This is all nitpicking, of course, but it really goes against what the previous two games were about. And hypothetically, if we were to change the name of BioShock Infinite to say Quantum Shock or the Columbia Paradox, almost all my major criticisms would be invalid, save for a few of the holdover things like, say, the voxophones, which don't make sense with Elizabeth. You could leave almost everything completely intact, including the absolutely bonkers, nonsensical ending of BioShock Infinite, which we're not going to dwell on too much because, yeah, that's going to be another video. If anything, not calling BioShock Infinite BioShock would be even better, because that said ending would have more impact as Elizabeth's powers have grown so much that she literally ripped you out of the game and into another title by the creators. Infinite's constant need to remind you that you are in a BioShock game gives off an air of maybe Irrational Games and Mr. Levine were unsure about how well this game would sell if it was just on its own. The game is constantly throwing throwbacks and reminders at you to tell you that this is a BioShock game. Is it someone new being the first thing you hear entering the city? Ken Levine throwing sideways insults at you through vending machines? And an antagonistic figure that you spend the first 2/3 of the game fighting before finally confronting him in a surprisingly non-violent fashion, and they proceed to tell you what's really going on before using your hands to take their life, leaving you to resolve the true matters at hand going on inside the city. This game is constantly trying to tell you, hey, look at how BioShock we are, even though so many other things show that this game would have been better off being its own thing. If this game were free of its BioShock title and also didn't have to constantly remind you of its pedigree, say with Comstock's very out-of-place Shodan-like voice over the megaphones and having the weird vending machines that kind of don't make sense when you're in the middle of a bazaar, it would be so much better off for everyone involved. Calling BioShock Infinite will be like calling BioShock System Shock Rapture. It just doesn't make sense, and it's detrimental to all parties involved. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this whole thing. If you think I'm full of garbage, go ahead and tell me in the comments. Be sure to like, subscribe, and help me out on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.